Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling the K-1 Fiancé Visa,
Okay.
and specifically a question that we get from a lot of people.
Yeah.
Is it an immigrant or a non-immigrant visa?
Right.
You've sent us a stack of articles, expert opinions, even some official sources.
Yeah.
And honestly, even those seem to be confused.
It is a fascinating puzzle, isn't it? The K-1 really sits in this gray area of the U.S. immigration system.
Okay, so before we get lost in the weeds here,
Yeah.
let's define our terms.
Okay.
I know it seems basic,
Yeah.
but the whole immigrant versus non-immigrant distinction is really the heart of the matter here.
You're right. It's foundational. And it all boils down to the intended length of stay. An immigrant visa is like a one-way ticket. It's for someone who's planning to live in the U.S. permanently. A non-immigrant visa is temporary, more like a round trip with a specific end date.
Got it. So where does the K-1 fit in?
Officially, it's classified as a non-immigrant visa.
Okay.
And there are a few reasons for that.
Yeah.
One is the application itself. The K-1 uses the DS-160 form,
Right.
which is the same one used for tourist visas and other short-term visits.
Okay.
It might seem like a small detail,
Yeah.
but it really reflects that initial framing of the visa.
Interesting. So even though the goal is ultimately marriage
Right.
and presumably living in the U.S. long term,
Right.
the paperwork starts off treating you like a tourist.
Precisely. And there's another element that reinforces that temporary status. The 90-day rule.
Yeah.
You have just 90 days after entering the U.S. on a K-1 to get married.
Wow.
That built-in deadline really underscores the visa's temporary nature.
Yeah, it definitely adds a layer of pressure to the whole getting to know you phase of the relationship.
It certainly does.
Yeah.
And then there's the I-134, the Affidavit of Support. This is typically used for non-immigrant visas
Okay.
and focuses on proving that someone can financially support the visa holder during their temporary stay.
Okay, so we've got the application form.
Yeah.
We've got the 90-day deadline, the financial affidavit,
Right.
all pointing toward non-immigrant. But I have a feeling there's more to the story.
You're absolutely right. If we stop here, we're missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. And this is where the K-1 gets really interesting, where that hybrid nature we hear so much about comes in. It starts behaving a lot like an immigrant visa in some pretty significant ways.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff. I'm ready to hear about these immigrant-like aspects.
Well, let's start with something that might surprise you. You need a medical exam to get a K-1 visa. Not just a quick checkup either. We're talking a full workup, screenings for communicable diseases, required vaccinations, a review of your medical history, the whole 9 yards.
Wow, that's pretty intense for a visa that's technically for a temporary visit.
Right,
It sounds more like what you'd expect for someone planning to, settle permanently.
exactly. And it's not just the medical exam. You also need to provide police certificates from every country you've lived in for a significant period of time after turning 16. Again, this is something you wouldn't typically see for a standard tourist visa. Really digging into your background.
So it seems like they're looking for reasons to say no, even though the visa is, designed for people who are already in a committed relationship.
That's an interesting point. It definitely suggests a certain level of scrutiny that goes beyond simply verifying someone's identity or intent to visit temporarily.
And there's another detail that really jumped out at me in one of these articles.
Yeah,
The K-1 is actually processed by the immigrant visa unit at U.S. embassies and consulates,
right.
not the non-immigrant visa section.
That's right. It's a pretty strong indicator that even within the U.S. immigration system, there's this recognition that this visa doesn't quite fit the usual non-immigrant mold.
And then, of course, there's the elephant in the room.
Right.
What happens after you enter the U.S. on a K-1?
Yeah.
Get married, hopefully,
Sure.
and then what?
Then things shift dramatically. You're able to apply for permanent residency, a green card. This is the ultimate goal for most K-1 visa holders. And it's a stark contrast to most non-immigrant visas, which are designed for temporary stays and don't offer any path to permanent status.
So it's like a non-immigrant visa that's secretly an immigrant visa in disguise.
That's a great way to put it. It's this built-in expectation of transitioning to permanent residency that really makes the K-1 stand out. It blurs the lines between the two categories in a way that no other visa really does.
No wonder you said it's a fascinating puzzle.
Right? Yeah.
So we've got this visa that's officially non-immigrant,
Yeah.
but it has all these elements that scream immigrant intent. Why do you think it's structured this way? What's the logic behind this hybrid approach?
That's a great question. And one that gets to the heart of some bigger questions about U.S. immigration policy.
Yeah.
It seems to reflect a balancing act between acknowledging the importance of family reunification, allowing U.S. citizens to bring their loved ones into the country, while still maintaining a certain level of control over who gets to stay permanently.
So it's a way to give people a chance to build a life together in the U.S., but with a few extra checks and balances along the way?
Exactly. It allows for a period of adjustment and evaluation, both for the couple and for the U.S. government, before granting permanent residency.
Okay, that makes sense. But I can also see how this hybrid nature could create a lot of confusion and uncertainty for people navigating the K-1 process.
Absolutely. It's not always clear which rules apply, which expectations are reasonable, and what the long-term implications might be.
And even the official sources seem to struggle with how to categorize the K-1.
Yeah.
One of the articles you sent mentions that the Department of State and Customs and Border Protection have different classifications on their websites.
It's true. It's almost as if they're grappling with the same questions we are down. Is it a non-immigrant visa with a special twist? Or is it essentially an immigrant visa with a delayed start? The answer seems to be a bit of both.
So for our listener out there who's trying to make sense of all this, where do we even begin? Should we treat the K-1 process like we would a non-immigrant visa application? Or approach it with the same level of rigor and preparation as we would an immigrant visa?
That's a really important question. And the answer is, you need to do both.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
You need to be aware of the temporary nature of the visa initially, understand that 90-day deadline, and make sure you're meeting the requirements for a non-immigrant stay. But at the same time, you need to approach it with the understanding that this is just the first step on a longer journey.
A journey that will hopefully end with a green card and a new life in the U.S.
Exactly. So you need to be prepared for the level of scrutiny and documentation that comes with that long-term goal.
So you're saying we need to be strategic, thinking several steps ahead throughout the entire K-1 process.
Absolutely. It's not just about getting the visa, it's about setting yourself up for success in the long run.
I like it. It's like playing chess, not checkers.
That's a great analogy. And it's a game that requires careful planning and a deep understanding of the rules.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to shift gears and dive into the actual steps involved in the K-1 visa process. Let's walk our listener through what they can expect from the very beginning to that final moment of holding that green card.
Sounds good to me. Let's demystify the process.
Yeah.
All right, so let's map out this K-1 journey. Where does it all begin?
Well, like any good adventure, it starts with a quest. In this case, the quest for a mountain of paperwork.
That's one way to put it. The first official step is filing the I-129F petition. That's the petition for alien fiancé. And this is where that strategic thinking we talked about comes in.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about this strategic approach to paperwork.
Well, you're not just filling out forms, you're building a case. You're presenting evidence that this relationship is the real deal.
Right.
That it's based on love and commitment, not just a desire for a green card.
So it's not just about checking boxes, it's about telling a story.
Exactly. A love story backed up by solid evidence. And that evidence can take many forms. Photos, of course, are a must-have.
Right.
But we're not talking about a few random selfies.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. What kind of photos are they looking for?
Think about it like this. You're trying to create a visual timeline of your relationship.
Yeah.
Photos from trips you've taken together, holidays you've celebrated, events you've attended. Anything that shows you've shared experiences and built a life together, even if it's been long distance.
So you're painting a picture of a couple who genuinely enjoys each other's company and has invested time and effort in building a relationship.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of the little details.
Oh.
A photo of you two cooking dinner together.
Oh, yeah.
A screenshot of a video call with silly filters. A boarding pass from a flight you took to visit each other. Those small moments can really add depth and authenticity to your story.
It's like those seemingly insignificant details in a novel that make the characters and their relationships feel more real and relatable.
I love that analogy. And speaking of stories, don't forget about the power of words, letters, emails, texts. Those can be incredibly powerful in conveying the emotional depth of your connection.
So it's not just about proving that you know each other, it's about showing that you truly care for each other and have a bond that goes beyond the superficial.
Exactly. Share your hopes and dreams, your fears and vulnerabilities, your inside jokes and shared memories. Let your personalities shine through and give the immigration officials a glimpse into the unique dynamics of your relationship.
Okay, so we've got photos, letters, emails. What about more official documents? Do things like joint bank accounts or shared leases help to strengthen the case?
They can, but it's important to remember that these documents aren't always accessible, especially for couples who've been living in different countries. And they're not a magic bullet.
Right.
The focus should always be on building a comprehensive and compelling narrative using a variety of evidence.
Got it. So you've submitted your meticulously crafted love story, complete with a supporting cast of photos and documents. What happens next?
Then comes the waiting game, and this is where patience and perseverance became your best friends. The I-129F petition can take anywhere from 5 to 12 months to be processed by USCIS.
Wow, that's quite a wait. What can people do to make the most of that time?
Well, first and foremost, stay organized.
Right.
Keep track of all your correspondence with USCIS. Make sure your contact information is up to date, and be prepared to respond promptly to any requests for additional information.
And I imagine communication with your fiancé is more important than ever during this waiting period.
Absolutely. It's a time of anticipation and uncertainty, so staying connected,
Yeah.
being supportive, and celebrating small milestones along the way can make a big difference.
Okay, so let's say the petition is approved. What's the next hurdle?
Then the petition makes its way to the National Visa Center and eventually to the U.S. Embassy or consulate in your fiancé's home country. This is where the interview process begins.
Okay, the interview. This is the part that makes most people nervous, right?
It can be, but it's also an opportunity to really shine. Remember that story you've been building with all that evidence. This is your chance to bring it to life, to show the consular officer the genuine connection you and your fiancé share.
So it's like the climax of the story, the moment of truth.
Exactly. Be prepared to answer questions about your relationship, your plans for the future, and your knowledge of each other's lives. And be yourself. Let your love and excitement shine through.
That's great advice. So you've aced the interview. You've jumped through all the bureaucratic hoops. You're in the U.S., you're married. Is it smooth sailing from here?
Well, not quite. Remember, the K-1 visa is just the first step.
Yeah.
Once you're married, the next challenge is adjusting your status to become a lawful permanent resident.
Oh, okay.
And that involves another round of paperwork and scrutiny.
Wait, seriously? I thought getting married was the finish line.
It's a major milestone, for sure, but the race isn't over yet. Now, you need to convince USCIS that your marriage is bona fide, that it's a real, loving, lasting union, not just a marriage of convenience for immigration purposes.
So they're basically making sure you didn't just get married for the green card.
Exactly. And they'll be looking for evidence to support that. Think joint bank accounts, a shared lease or mortgage, photos from your wedding and life together. All those things that demonstrate a shared life and commitment.
So keep that relationship scrapbook going.
Absolutely. Document, document, document. It can make all the difference in smoothing the path to that coveted green card.
Okay, so we've talked about the evidence needed to prove a genuine relationship, the interview process,
Right.
the steps involved in adjusting status. Are there any other potential challenges or pitfalls that people should be aware of when navigating the K-1 visa journey?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is simply the sheer amount of paperwork and documentation required. It can feel overwhelming, especially if you're unfamiliar with the U.S. immigration system. That's why it's so important to be organized and meticulous from the start.
Yeah, I can imagine it's easy to get lost in a sea of forms and deadlines.
It definitely can be. And another challenge is dealing with processing times, which can be unpredictable and often quite lengthy. It's important to be patient and persistent, and to understand that delays are common.
So, a healthy dose of patience and a good filing system are essential tools for any K-1 applicant. What about legal help? When does it make sense to consult with an immigration attorney?
An immigration attorney can be invaluable throughout the K-1 process.
Okay.
Especially if you have any complicating factors in your case, things like a criminal history, previous immigration violations, or anything that might raise a red flag.
So they're like a guide, helping you navigate this complex and sometimes confusing system.
Exactly. They can help you understand the requirements, prepare your application, and advocate for you if any issues arise. They can also help you avoid costly mistakes and ensure that your application is as strong as possible.
It sounds like having an experienced guide by your side can make all the difference.
It absolutely can, especially when the stakes are so high.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've talked about the hybrid nature of the K-1 visa,
Right.
the importance of building a compelling narrative, the interview process, and the challenges of adjusting status. What are some key takeaways for our listener? What do they really need to remember as they embark on this journey?
I think the most important thing is to go into it with your eyes wide open. Understand that it's a complex process with a lot of moving parts. Be prepared to be patient, persistent, and detail-oriented. And don't be afraid to seek help and support when you need it.
That's great advice. It's a journey that requires both heart and a good head for strategy.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And remember, listener, even though it's a process with challenges,
Yeah,
it's a journey driven by love and the desire to build a life together.
and that's a powerful force to have on your side.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to shift gears one last time and explore some of the broader implications of the K-1 visa. We've talked about the personal journey, but what about the bigger picture? How does this unique visa fit into the larger context of U.S. immigration policy and the ongoing debate about family reunification?
That's a great question, and one that deserves its own deep dive.
We've spent a lot of time unpacking the ins and outs of the K-1 visa process,
Yeah,
but I think it's time to zoom out a bit and consider the bigger picture.
I agree. It's easy to get caught up in the details.
Yeah.
But the K-1 visa actually touches on some really significant issues in U.S. immigration policy.
Right. Like, we've established that it's designed to facilitate family reunification, allowing U.S. citizens to bring their fiancés into the country. But how does that fit into the broader goals and priorities of the U.S. immigration system?
That's a complex question.
Yeah.
And it's one that lawmakers and policymakers have been grappling with for decades.
Yeah.
On the one hand, there's a recognition that family ties are a powerful motivator for immigration, and that keeping families together is a humanitarian goal.
It makes sense. You want to make it possible for people to build lives with the people they love,
Right,
regardless of where they were born.
exactly. But on the other hand,
Yeah.
there's also the issue of border control and managing the flow of immigration to ensure that it aligns with the country's economic and social needs.
So it's a balancing act,
Yeah.
trying to find a way to welcome families while also setting limits and priorities.
Precisely. And the K-1 visa is a fascinating example of how those competing priorities play out in the real world.
Because it's like saying, yes, we value family reunification,
Right.
but we're also going to make you jump through some hoops to prove that your relationship is genuine and that you're not just trying to game the system.
That's a great way to put it. The K-1 process, with its emphasis on evidence,
Right.
interviews, and background checks, reflects a certain level of skepticism towards marriage-based immigration.
Which is understandable to a degree.
Right. There's been cases of marriage fraud, where people try to exploit the system for their own benefit.
Of course. But that skepticism also raises some important ethical questions. Is it fair to subject loving couples to this level of scrutiny just because they happen to fall in love with someone from another country?
Yeah, it makes you wonder if we're putting up unnecessary barriers to love and happiness in the name of security.
It's a valid concern. And it highlights the inherent tension between protecting national interests and upholding human rights.
And then there's the question of how the K-1 visa compares to other pathways to immigration.
Yeah.
We have visas for skilled workers,
Right.
for investors, for refugees.
Yeah.
How do we decide which categories to prioritize and how many visas to allocate to each one?
That's a question that sparks a lot of debate.
Yeah,
And there are strong arguments to be made on all sides.
right.
Some people believe that family-based immigration should be the top priority, arguing that it strengthens communities and promotes social cohesion, while others might argue that we should focus on attracting the best talent and investment from around the world to boost the economy and stay competitive globally.
Exactly. And then there are those who advocate for a more humanitarian approach, prioritizing refugees and asylum seekers fleeing persecution and violence.
So it's not just about numbers, it's about values and priorities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the K-1 visa, with its focus on love and marriage, sits right at the heart of this complex and often contentious conversation.
It's like a microcosm of the larger immigration debate,
Yeah.
reflecting all the hopes,
Right.
fears, and challenges we face as a nation.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah,
And it reminds us that immigration policy isn't just about abstract rules and regulations.
right.
It's about real people, real relationships, and real lives.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the K-1 Fiancé Visa, I think it's important to remember that it's not just a bureaucratic process. It's a human story.
It's a story about love, commitment, and the pursuit of happiness, often against the odds.
And it's a story that reflects the ongoing evolution of the American identity as we grapple with what it means to be a nation of immigrants in a rapidly changing world.
Beautifully put.
So, listener, as you continue your own explorations of the world of immigration, keep these questions in mind.
Yeah.
How do we balance border security with family reunification? How do we create a system that is both fair and compassionate?
Right.
And how do we ensure that immigration policies reflect our values and aspirations as a nation?
Those are questions worth pondering.
And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the complexities of the K-1 visa.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those tough questions.